Our speaker today is Lizzie Copp, the Head of Transport and Infrastructure at the Market Research and Political Polling organisation Ipsos UK. Lizzie's conducted social research at Ipsos for 12 years, mainly working with public sector clients like the Department for Transport, local authorities, also arm's length bodies and charities. Much of the transport research conducted by Lizzie and the team at Ipsos focuses on how and why people travel in the way they do, the experiences they have, and the changes that they would like to see in the future. This ranges from everything from examining how travel patterns changed during the pandemic, the barriers to travel from specific groups in society sometimes face, and what could enable better travel in the context of wider social and economic trends and environmental challenges. For today, Lizzie will be drawing on Ipsos's in-house polling on politics, sustainability and transport to tell us what the public are thinking 1 week before the general election. So we're really lucky to have Lizzie with us here today. I want to just remind people, please do ask questions throughout the presentation and then we'll come to them at the Q&A afterwards. As a reminder then, we're not looking for questions in the chat facility, but in the Q&A tab instead. So you can see that at the top of your screen. You can go along and open the Q&A box and please do just enter your questions in there and then we'll try to answer as many of them as possible after the presentation. So thank you very much once again, Lizzie, for being here. I will now pass it over to you.
Thank you, Sam. Thanks very much for having me here today. And thank you to everyone who's dialed in so far. As Sam mentioned, I'm a social researcher at the independent research organisation Ipsos UK. I work within our Social Research Institute, so that's part of Ipsos, and I lead a team of researchers who are dedicated to transport and infrastructure research and policy evaluation specifically. So Sam mentioned I'm going to be sharing the latest of our public polling today. And the title of this presentation is The Politics of Sustainable Transport. I don't have a sense of who might be here for the politics. If that's what you're after, then super, because that's where we're going to go first, or who might be interested in the sustainability aspect and the transport aspect. We're definitely going to be coming to that. So stay with me and stay tuned if that's what you're after. I think I'll crack on with the first slide then, please. Okay. 8 in 10 of us are saying that we think it's time for a change at the next election. So that's the mood of the nation. That's where we're at as we head towards the election in 1 week's time. And this figure has only got larger and larger. It was 73 about a month ago, and it sat in the high 60s. All the other times that we've taken this measure with the public in nationally representative survey polling over the last year and a half or so. So if we go to the next slide, please. Thank you. What's going on then? What's the state of play at the moment? This is our latest vote share polling, which was released yesterday. 42 Labour, 19% Conservative. That's a drop since earlier in the month when we took this measure. Labour have shifted from 43 earlier in the month to 42%, saying that they would vote Labour if they're in election tomorrow. And we've seen an increase in the Reform vote share, remembering that this is vote share polling. It's not the MRP polls that you might have seen, which go down to projections at the seat level. This is just overall vote share. If we go to the next slide. A third of us say that we might change our mind. And you can probably see on the right-hand side of the chart there that has dropped since earlier in the month. So we're getting a little more sure about who we'll vote for. And on the next slide then, this is how the picture's looking in terms of satisfaction with leaders and the government. And there are some historic lows here. So again, this data was released yesterday. Polling was done over the weekend. Rishi Sunak is currently the most unpopular Prime Minister that we at Ipsos have ever measured at this stage in the campaign. 52% are saying that they're dissatisfied with the way that Starmer is doing his job, and a whopping 83% are dissatisfied with the way that the government is running the country. So we'll hold that figure in mind as we go to the next slide. There it is at the top there, and you can see how stark that is in relation to satisfaction and dissatisfaction with the way that the government is running the country. This is the worst score for a government in Ipsos's records at this stage of a campaign, going back to 1979, as you can see on the chart there. And the previous worst was 72% dissatisfied for Johnson's government in December 2019. So quite a stark picture that we're painting so far. If we go to the next slide, please. I've talked a little about politics there, but if we move over to perceptions of what's going on with the economy, this is often a very helpful barometer of what the public are thinking and feeling, the mood of the nation. And obviously we remain in a challenging situation with the cost of living crisis. So we've got more of us saying that we think the general economic condition of the country will get worse than those of us who are saying that we think it will improve. You can see from the trend chart there that this does move around, but overall we are net negative as a nation on the economy at the moment. And if we go to the next slide for a slightly longer term trend, so sorry, the labels on that x-axis are very tiny, but I can tell you that it starts at the late 90s. So you can see the dips about a third to a half of the way along. The dip is where we had the credit crunch around 2008, and then right along to the right hand side in 2022, that low level there was when inflation was at 11% and energy prices were soaring. So we've recovered a little from that. Obviously, we did have good news recently that we'd hit our inflation target of 2%, but it hasn't been enough to swing us to be net positive. And this is problematic for the Conservatives, who are known as sort of the party for the economy. And it was earlier in the month when we took this measure, it was -9, the net figure. So it's not really shifting in the way that the Conservatives would ideally like it to. If we go to the next slide then, a little more detail here from a global study that was conducted around spring. 4 in 10 of us in Britain think that inflation is going to increase over the next year or so from spring when that measure was taken. And just over half of us expect motoring fuel costs to rise a lot. And that's saying that that's going to happen over the next 6 months. Fuel costs are not exactly low at the moment. So again, this is quite striking data about how gloomy and glum we are, unsurprisingly, having been now in a cost of living crisis for a little while. So if we go to the next slide, please. Talked about politics and a little on the economy. Now I'm going to move us over into policy. So just to explain what's going on in this slide, this is an Ipsos measure that goes back quite some time, as you can see on the chart. And it tells us that policies have always, on this measure, they've always stood ahead in importance to voters, compared with the importance they place on the leaders of the parties that they intend to vote for, or the party as a whole. So that the figures there, they're not percentage figures. We've asked the public, if you had a total of 10 points to allocate according to how important each of these was to you, how many points would you allocate to the leaders of the party you intend to vote for, how many to its policies, and how many to the party as a whole? And as I say, you can see that policies is consistently higher than leaders or parties. So if we hold that in mind as we go through the rest of the presentation, when we're thinking about policies, and actually when this is cut by partisan group, we find that this pattern, this shape is the same, whether we're looking at what Conservative voters think or what Labour voters think. So uniformly, policy is quite important to people and how they're voting. On the next slide then, let's look at some actual policy areas. So who do the public think has the best party on key issues? And we're asking people here to pick one party. So you can see for the environment at the bottom that perhaps unsurprisingly, the Green Party occupy quite a big share there, 40% saying that. And this is ranked by the percentage saying that Labour have the best policy on each of these things. Transport, interestingly, is sitting in the middle. Actually, compared to the other policy areas and issue areas, we've got quite a chunk of the public saying that they don't know or they're selecting none of these parties actually. So there's a bit of a sense that perhaps people don't know what's going on with transport policy. Perhaps it doesn't have the clout and the gravitas of some of the other areas here, like healthcare. So we'll come back to this as I move through the presentation and we think about transport and sustainability in particular. If we go to the next slide, please. So what do the public think that the immediate priorities should be for a Starmer government? Unsurprisingly, the NHS comes out top, followed by dealing with, excuse me, the cost of living and growing the economy. I say this is unsurprising because every month Ipsos polls the public on, we ask people, what do you think is the biggest issue facing the country today, and what do you think the other biggest issues are? And it's very common for healthcare and the economy to come up near the top of that list in the issues index. We've got managing asylum and immigration has bubbled up a bit as well. Again, in a pre-election period, this is not an uncommon pattern to see, and people are responding to that in this question by saying this is what we think needs to be dealt with very quickly. Improving public transport is there, so nearly 1 in 10 picking that. If we go to the next slide, this question asks what the longer term priorities should be. And you might notice that improving the NHS has dropped down quite significantly. So there's a real sense that that needs to be dealt with very quickly after the election. And the relative position of things has changed such that improving public transport has actually bubbled up a bit. And 18% are saying that they think that should be the top longer term priorities. We'll come on to see why when we look at public opinions of public transport in particular. Next slide, please. So we're going to move over now to look at, excuse me, public support and opposition to some of the things that we've seen come out of the Labour, the Conservative and the Lib Dems manifestos. And as we do that, I'm going to do a deep dive on some issues so that we can start to understand what might be driving the shape of the results that we see. So we'll kick off with Labour. If we could go to that slide, please. What I've done in this section is taken the top 5 according to public support for these policies from the list that we presented to the public. So we didn't ask people about absolutely every single thing in the manifestos, but from the Labour manifesto, we asked about 19 of the things that were presented in it. And these are the top 5. We'll also go over to look at things that are related to transport and sustainable transport and the environment and climate change and that type of thing as well. So rather interestingly, we've got potholes taking second place in the ranking here from a list of 19 policies. And in some sense, that's not particularly controversial. Who wouldn't want the roads fixed and the potholes fixed? It's not a very controversial thing to propose. But on the other hand, what you'll come to see with the other manifestos and support and opposition from the public is that we're tending to see things like healthcare, policing, education at the top. So this is unusual in some sense, but 3/4 of us are saying that we'd support that pledge of putting 65 million a year into road maintenance to fix up to 1 million potholes on an annual basis. That's a lot. So if we go to the next slide, what's going on here? I'm taking us over to a different study now, where we looked at public satisfaction with our public services in this country, and the results are quite striking. The first thing to say with this is that of all the public services in the list here that we asked about, you can see on the right hand side how much satisfaction has dropped since 2021. It's quite unusual to see these types of drops when we do public opinion polling, and just to reassure, it was the same question wording and the same method, so it is a direct comparison from the 2024 data. Fieldwork was in April and into May, so not that long ago, and the 2021 data. I've highlighted local bus services, train companies, we're going to come back to those, and road maintenance and repairs is right at the bottom there. So it's probably no wonder then that that policy was quite high in terms of support in the previous slide. 82% of us are saying that we're dissatisfied with road maintenance and repairs. Go to the next slide, please. So here are some other things that cropped up in the manifestos, and we asked the public about their support and opposition for these things. I've picked out the ones now that relate to transport, energy, the environment, net zero, climate change, that type of thing. So we've got the potholes one at the top, and further down we've got 6 in 10 saying that they support renationalising the railways and bringing them into public ownership as contracts with existing operators expire. So if we move on to the next slide to see what is going on with public perceptions of rail, 4 in 10 of us rate the quality of rail services in Britain as poor, and that's larger than the proportion of us saying that they're good. Nearly as many of us are saying that the quality of rail services in Britain is going to get worse. So the here and now is bad, and we're not much more optimistic about the future of rail. If we go to the next slide for a little more detail from our rail polling, it was done earlier in the year. We had strikes in January and into February. 2 in 5 of us disagree that the railways in Britain provide good value for money for passengers. We've also got negative responses outweighing the positive for actually all of the things here on the slide. So reliability and the sense that the trains are well run. We've got over a third disagreeing that the trains are reliable and well run. We do have quite a chunk in the middle also saying that they have no views either way, and some of those may well be people who don't use rail that often. But we have found with our rail polling as well that it's the infrequent rail users who can have more negative perceptions than average, which is a bit of a concern from a sort of behaviour change point of view. If we're trying to encourage people to use public transport more, that would probably be the group that we'd want to target, because the frequent rail users are already using it as much as they can. People who never use the rail are going to be very difficult nuts to crack, but encouraging people to make some journeys, some more journeys by rail instead is probably what we might want to hope for, but this paints a picture of how difficult that might be to do in practice. So if we go to the next slide, please, we're moving over to the Conservatives manifesto and the top 5 things from the list of 16 policies that we presented to the public in our polling. You can see, unsurprisingly, healthcare is near the top. So we've got increasing NHS spending above the level of inflation, building new GP surgeries, police, number 3, and number 5 there, investing 36 billion in local roads, rail and buses, funded by cancelling the second phase of HS2. 68% support that. So if we dive a bit deeper into public opinions, if we go to the next slide, and look at what people think about public transport for that policy pledge there. I mentioned that opinions of rail are quite gloomy for the here and now, but you can see here that it's quite striking how pessimistic we are about the future as well. So 44% of us think that public transport is going to get worse, and the direction of those lines on the chart there, you can see how it's diverging. Fewer and fewer people saying that we expect public transport to get better. And the next slide then, this is just going back to one that we've already seen, just to remind ourselves of how much lower public satisfaction is with some of these services than it was in 2021. Dissatisfaction with excuse me, train companies, it far outweighs satisfaction. On local bus services, opinion is a little bit more divided, and I'm going to help explain why on the next slide, which gives us the regional picture on bus, road and train services. So if we go to the next slide, thank you. So the same data, but giving us the regional break on local bus services, road maintenance and repairs, and train companies. And just to say, this is showing net scores. So that's the percentage or the number of us who are satisfied minus those of us who are dissatisfied. You can see that mixed picture there across England, Scotland and Wales for bus services, the net score is quite positive, +40 in London, compared with the northeast, where those scores are much lower. For road maintenance and repairs, unfortunately, it's looking very low across the whole of the UK. And for train companies, still net negative everywhere, really, but with some regional differences. Again, slightly less negative in London compared with other regions. So let's hop on to the next slide. Going back to the policies in the Conservative manifesto, and I mentioned that as well as pulling out the top 5, I'd focus on anything that we've measured support and opposition on to do with transport, energy, the environment, net zero, climate change. So we've got that same one that we've already seen at the top there, investing in roads, rail, buses, funded by HS2 second phase cancellation. And then reaching net zero by 2050 while committing to no new green levies or taxes. Support for this is much lower. So I'm going to come back to that in a moment. If we hop over to the next slide, which is support and opposition to the types of things in the Liberal Democrats manifesto. The top 5 again shows lots on healthcare here, health and social care, and in fact there's nothing on transport and energy here, but it's worth noting how high the overall levels of support are for those top things. I mean, difficult to disagree with them and say that you wouldn't prioritise them perhaps, but these are some of the most popular policies that we've polled. On the next slide then, we do have one about the reaching net zero. So cutting greenhouse gas emissions to net zero by 2045 at the latest, rather than the government target of 2050. Again, support is comparatively lower for that. This was number 7 in the ranked list from 14 Lib Dem policies that we presented people. So there were things that garnered less support. It was about halfway up. So I'm going to do a bit of a deep dive on what's going on here. What do the public think about climate change, net zero, measures to address it and combat the climate emergency? So on the next slide then, this is taken for our issues index, which I mentioned earlier. We poll the public every month on what they think are the biggest issues facing Britain today. And this shows the movement that we see in people who are spontaneously mentioning pollution, the environment, climate change. It does move around a bit. We tend to see it jumps right up when we're experiencing heat waves, floods. It was also much higher during the COP26 climate change summit. That got a lot of coverage, obviously, in the media. If we go to the next slide, this also tells us where climate change concern is sitting relative to other things. So this question that we posed to the public, and that was earlier this month, was looking ahead to the next general election, which, if any, issues do you think will be very important to you in helping you decide which party to vote for? 1 in 10 have said that protecting the environment and climate change would be very important in helping them to decide which party to vote for. It's not it's not up there at the top, but unsurprisingly, what we do have at the top is the things that we know people are typically very concerned about all the time, but particularly in the run up to an election. So again, it's healthcare, immigration, the state of the economy, and managing inflation and that type of thing. If we hop over to the next slide then, please. Those figures, they may appear slightly low to you, but we have to remember that we were asking people about issues, plural, that are facing the country today. And there's a lot to be worried about. There's a lot going on at the moment. And it's not the same as asking about absolute concern. So when we just go straight in and ask people, how concerned are you about climate change? And so we're only asking about climate change here. We can see the absolute levels of concern are much higher. So over 3/4 of us are saying that we're concerned. That far outweighs the proportion who are saying that we're not concerned about climate change. The next slide This one comes from a study which we've conducted with the Centre for Climate Change and Social Transformations, and it shows quite a similar picture. So this one's asking about how worried people are about climate change, and again 77% are saying that they're worried. Among them, a fair proportion saying that they're extremely or very worried. This has actually fallen slightly since 2022. Partly owing to the fact that the proportion saying they're extremely or very worried has also dropped. If we go to the next slide, we can see that there are partisan differences here. So the figure of 37% saying that they're extremely or very worried about climate change, it rises to around half or just over among people who voted Labour or Lib Dem in the 2019 election, and it drops to a quarter of us when we look at those who voted Conservative in 2019. If I move us on to the next slide then, to contextualize this, what does this mean if worry about climate change has dropped? Well, it's still quite high, but half of us are saying that we'd be more likely to vote for a party which will take strong action on climate change. And that's statement A on the left there. We're much more likely to say that than we are to agree with statement B, which says that we'd be more likely to vote for a political party which says that they'll slow down actions against things that cause climate change because it's not necessary or we can't afford the additional cost and investment right now. So concern about climate change is still high, even if that strength of sentiment has weakened slightly since 2022, but we are still wanting something done about it. And I think that's quite important to hold in mind. If we go to the next slide then, in the same study, we presented the public with a whole range of net zero measures or policies. And some of these you'll notice relate to transport. Some of them are about other things like increasing vegetarian or vegan options. And just have a look at where the transport ones sit relative to the other ones in the list. Electric vehicles subsidies are at the bottom of that list. So for everything else here, support for these policies or measures, it far outweighs opposition. But that's not the case for electric vehicle subsidies, where opposition is actually slightly higher than support. And I think that statement on the previous slide gives us some clues here. The idea that we can't afford the additional costs or investment right now, and the public are very aware of how much electric vehicles cost. The second-hand market is not about to emerge overnight, tomorrow, or indeed the day after the election. So this presents us with some interesting questions about where we might go next with policy on transport and electric vehicles in particular, bearing in mind the Labour manifesto has pledged to bring that phase out date of internal combustion engine vehicle new sales, to bring that back from 2035 to 2030. It's not that many years away, and yet public opinion is looking a little divided around electric vehicles. We go to the next slide, please. Why is this important? Well, in a different study that was fielded around the same time as the last one, 7 in 10 of us say that our lifestyle means that we need a vehicle. So we are still a car-dominated nation, as many of us probably know. Having a vehicle our car is important to us if we own one. And the next slide, if we turn over, shows that nearly half of us, quite a substantial proportion, are saying that the transport links in our local area are not good enough, and that will include public transport links. So this stuff is going to matter to the public if we do end up having a new phase-out date for the new sales of petrol or diesel vehicles. And the next slide then, thank you. In the same study that the previous figures just then were taken from, we posed a number of measures to the public and asked them how much they support or oppose each of the following actions to reduce the UK's carbon emissions. So that's how these were framed. It was about reducing emissions. And for most of them, we do still have majority support, but the little white triangles and the figures on the right-hand side are showing that this has actually dropped when these same questions were fielded using the same survey techniques 2 years ago in 2022. And again, you can see encouraging the use of electric vehicles instead of a petrol or diesel vehicle. It's sitting at the bottom there on this slide. So it's quite interesting. We can interpret this in different ways. Either that support is lower and it's dropped for all of these things, but perhaps in the context of the cost of living crisis and extremely low confidence in public services, extremely high dissatisfaction with government, we could ask, perhaps it's surprising that there is majority support for some of these things at all, because that's the national context that we're looking at the moment. And on the next slide then, these are some of the measures that were asked about in the same study, where opposition does actually outweigh support. So encouraging people to travel abroad less, introducing low traffic neighbourhoods. So if we move on then to some closing thoughts, but I do still have a few more charts to go. Well done if you've stayed with me with all this data so far. On the next slide, we've got the percentage who think that the policies from the manifestos are going to deliver a positive change and negative change, or would they not change anything at all? So 78% of us said that we think it's time for change at the general election, and not quite as many, but nearly as many are saying that the Labour Party, their policies in the manifesto would deliver a positive change. Next slide then. So we heard earlier on about what people think of the policies in the manifestos, but do people think that they can actually be delivered, and are they affordable? There's a mixed picture here with a bit of scepticism around some of these plans. So on the one hand, the public are more confident that the Labour Party's policies are affordable and would be delivered competently if they were in government. But on the other hand, we still have quite large numbers who aren't confident in any of these three parties' pledges. Half of Britons are not confident that the policies in the Labour manifesto are affordable with the party's tax and spending plans. And that figure rises for Liberal Democrats and the Conservatives, as you can see in the top chart there. If we go to the next slide, then I thought this was quite interesting to look at leader image as we're heading towards the next election, potentially looking very likely we're going to have a new leader. What do people think about whether they are out of touch with ordinary people? So 3/4 of us are saying that about Sunak. And actually 4 in 10 are saying that about Starmer. Maybe surprising. We can see the figures here for the other people on the slide. It's not out of kilter with the figures for other Labour leaders. Perhaps people just don't think that any politician is in touch with ordinary people. But Starmer's figure there is, it's not far off Liz Truss's. She is there, but she's a mere dot on this chart because her tenure was so short. If we look at a similar thing but on the next slide, it's a different measure. Leader image on understanding the problems facing Britain. Starmer is above Sunak there, but fewer than half of us are saying that we think he understands the problems facing Britain. And I think that's quite interesting because, as we've seen from some of the previous data that I've shared, there is a sense among the public that there are a lot of problems facing Britain at the moment. So when it comes to forming new policies and doing new things after the general election, that's something that we really need to bear in mind. There's the satisfaction levels with Starmer, they were obviously better than Sunak's, but they weren't sort of overwhelmingly positive. And as I said, the satisfaction levels with government were very, very low. So on the next slide then, some final closing thoughts from me. Sorry about this cough, folks. We have a dim public mood right now on public services and the economy and government and our political leaders. There is a strong sense that something needs to be done and change is needed. And that definitely carries through to opinions of transport and the types of things that were suggested in the manifestos. That's in the backdrop of some quite negative polling around public transport, especially for rail, and also for the state of the roads. And we've seen public majority support for the most part for the transport and net zero measures that we've polled on. We know as well that climate change, the environment and sustainability, they are still a problem. In the public's eyes, they are still up there as a big concern to the public, even if they are clearly competing with other immediate issues like healthcare and the economy. And we've probably all heard the word polycrisis thrown around over the last year or two. As I say, that there's so much going on and there have been so many things to worry about that the climate change isn't necessarily taking the top spot. It doesn't mean that people don't care about it. So I think there are interesting implications for policy post-election. We've seen a little about what the public think of the what might be introduced, but we need to better understand how these things might pan out. Transport was actually quite light in the Labour manifesto, so we need to understand more about how things might happen. And there's going to be a really strong need to listen to the public and engage with the public on those things to make sure that we have public acceptability and support. And I mentioned EVs earlier, but I think that's a really good example of where things could get quite interesting. Anything around EVs seems to have lower public support than other net zero measures in transport. And when we conduct qualitative research with the public in some of our other studies, we hear people saying things like, obviously they're very expensive. Are we going to create an environmental problem with used batteries piling up? How much do the batteries cost to replace? There's a tiny bit about batteries in the Labour manifesto, but that was more about comparing performance. Are electric vehicles going to damage the roads because they're much heavier? There's also something about weight of vehicles in the Lib Dem manifesto that was quite interesting. And people are quite aware that they are a completely new vehicle that's made from new materials. So potential debates to be had there about the extent to which electric vehicles are actually environmentally friendly. So it feels like there's lots to come, although some of the manifestos were lighter than others on sustainability and transport in particular. It feels like there are lots of conversations to come with the public on where we go next. So that's it from me. I hope that that's been interesting and delivered something new, something to think about, whether you're attending today thinking about this as an individual, or whether you're actually here thinking about your own organisation and your staff and how they travel about. So hopefully some food for thought, and I think we'll go over to some Q&A now.
Thank you, Lizzie. That was fascinating. I think most of us have become obsessed with polling over the last few months. So there was an incredible amount of detail there. So thank you very much for sharing that with us. We have got some questions in the Q&A. However, I had a couple of questions first. So I was looking at the slides where there was reference to pledges around net zero, and I saw there was a Tory pledge of net zero by 2050, but there was also a tax element to it as well, wasn't there? There was no new green taxes combined within the policy. But then on the next slide, there was a Lib Dem pledge to bring net zero forward by 5 years to 2045. There was slightly more support for the Lib Dem pledge. I suppose, why is that? Do we have any sense from the public about when we should be hitting net zero by, or if at all?
Yeah, I think this is a really difficult ones. We don't have it's a funny timescale to think about, right? We don't really have a sense of whether we think that 2045 or 2050 is too far away, too close, or whatever. But interesting that you picked up on the tax and spend element in the Conservative one, because I think we can have a tendency to think nobody likes taxes, and nobody wants to see taxes increase. And of course, when we're thinking about our own pocket and our own purse, then that might be what we personally think. We don't want to see our own taxes rising. But we are in a situation where there is a crisis of confidence in public services, and the public are aware that they need to be paid for. So in some polling earlier in the month, actually 37% of voters said that they want an increase in spending on public services, even if it means that they pay more in taxes. So I think that the kind of tax dynamic is quite interesting, and we shouldn't jump to conclusions about how the public think things should be paid for.
No, that's really interesting. Obviously, tax has featured so highly in this election. That's why it was interesting to see how that might have affected the public opinion towards that net zero pledge. The other question I had then was, well, I was looking at sentiment really, and where and how salient I suppose climate sits when we think about how people might vote. And there was a question there that you asked. So, which issues will help decide your vote? And only 10% said protecting the environment and climate change. Why do we think this is? Has this dropped in recent years? Do we think? I know that you said that it's. I think you used the term polycrisis. Is it just because there is this crisis in the NHS, a perceived cost of living crisis, perceived crisis in housing? Is it because there are these multiple crises that this has just dropped down the list? And can we expect that it might rise up the rankings if those problems are perceived to be resolved in the next few years?
Yeah, I think it's far more likely that it's due to the sheer number of issues that people recognise need to be resolved in the country. I think that is far more likely than it not being important to people. And there are just so many things that are of concern to the public, and important, or indeed very important, I think was the question wording, to how they vote in the next election. I think it's really important that we don't assume that because support for some net zero measures appears to have weakened. It's quite important that we don't assume that nobody cares about the environment, especially in relation to transport, because it's a bit more nuanced and complex than that.
Yeah, just looking at some of the questions in the Q&A. So from Christine Warren then, transport does seem to be very light, and I think you referenced that in some of the manifestos. There isn't a huge amount on transport, maybe disappointingly for some. There does it says here then, so they seem to have moved to the right to favour drivers. Is this partly about concern over road maintenance, or some backlash to the 20 mile per hour speed limit programmes in Wales?
Yeah, interesting. I do think that in and of itself, road maintenance and fixing potholes is actually very important to the public. Problematic if we see roads closed for the roadworks to happen while those fixes and repairs are happening. But it crops up a lot. Again, when we conduct qualitative research with the public, people talk about potholes a lot as a real source of aggro on the road. And I suppose the roads are a universal thing. So they're not just annoying for drivers, they're annoying and very, very dangerous for cyclists and motorcyclists, annoying for pedestrians, maybe as they're crossing the road, and people on buses. We were chatting a couple of days ago about if you're sitting on a bus and it's really bumpy and you've got potholes, that could be really off-putting to you taking the bus again. So it's a thing that can impact everyone. You can see them, you can feel them, it's tangible, compared with other things like air pollution, which we might talk about with reference to transport, but you can't see it, it's not so visible. So I think that might have something to do with why there is such a strong sense from the public that needs to be sorted and fixed, and such high support there. Sorry, I don't know if I've answered the question because I've forgotten the first
No, I
bit that
think
you
you have.
asked me.
Yeah, no, thank you. I was also just reading then a question from Andrew Barry Purcell, and I think he's interested then in opposition to LTNs, scrapping ULEZ in London and bus lanes. Obviously, we've been looking at net zero and when and the various pledges in relation to this, but obviously there has been some sort of anti-sentiment towards net zero as well with scrapping ULEZ, like Andrew says. Do we have any sense of this? Is this bubbling up? Obviously, we've seen parties like Reform that have been pushing this agenda. What sort of impact do you think parties like Reform have had on this debate?
Yeah, interesting. The movement in support for reform has happened quite quickly, and we haven't polled very frequently on these things to be able to say what an impact it's had. But I suppose there's two ways of looking at it. That there is still, when we've asked about things like low traffic neighbourhoods, there is still over a third of people who say that they support that. So yes, it does seem like that there's been a bit of chatter and culture war conversation has been stoked over these types of issues. But it's not the case that everybody is against these things, because that's not what the data in the presentation has shown. We didn't poll on 20 mile per hour limits, but these things cropped up, didn't they, in the Conservative manifesto in their sections on transport. And there was an interesting section in a box which said we're not going to do a blanket rollout of these types of things, and also we're not going to do a pay per mile approach to road pricing, which I don't think was being necessarily proposed in the other manifestos. I think road pricing might have cropped up in the Greens. So it's to say that the public hate these things that's not true. That's not what the data says. But opinion is more divided. Compared with other things that are perhaps a bit less controversial, like encouraging people to walk or cycle. Who would disagree with that? Well, apparently 12% of us oppose that. So you can see how hard it is in this sort of national environment that we're in at the moment to actually get high levels of support for any of these types of measures.
Mm. Yeah, thank you. There's an interesting question coming from Sam Knight at the bottom. So this is around HS2, and that's about the Conservative scrapping of HS2 and then diverting the money elsewhere. So 36 billion promised for local projects. Is it possible to say then from the polling, is this based on frustration with HS2, or actually is it more about support for local projects?
That's a really good question, and we can't unpick it from that statement, because you're right, there were two things going on there: the investment in transport, and then the scrapping of the I think it was the second leg of HS2. So it's a little tricky to tell there. And HS2 was it was mysteriously absent from some of the manifestos, wasn't it? It wasn't really talked about too much. So it feels like the Labour approach to being very careful about pledges that are being made is applying to HS2 as well.
Hmm. This is an interesting question. So it's from Lewis Lippiat, reference polycrisis. So I think, so sorry, Lewis, if I'm sort of misrepresenting your question. I think he's looking for kind of evidence about how public feel when you I suppose the intersection between different policy areas. So I think he's referencing then the cost of living crisis and then net zero sustainability policies. And he's given an example then. So it's cheaper to ride a bike or drive than it is to use a car. So transport can sort of be a solution if you invest in transport to ease in the cost of living crisis. Do we have any evidence on how the public are joining the dots with regards to those two policy areas?
I think that's a really interesting question, because the point was made there that some net zero measures like modal switch to active travel doesn't have to cost a lot of money. But when we're having conversations with the public in our research, we often find that there is a bit of a knee-jerk reaction that anything to do with net zero is going to cost money, especially if people start thinking about electric vehicles, and people are quite aware of the cost of taking public transport like rail as well. So it's sometimes people tend to think that sustainable transport approaches are going to cost them, even if they might perhaps not. And I think it was Earth Day polling, which I should say you can Google all of the polling that's shown today. Ipsos's Earth Day polling done in spring of this year. I'm pretty sure it was that study that showed that quite a chunk of the public agreed with the statement, I'm too worried about the cost of living crisis to basically change other things like how people travel. So it's very, very top of mind, and it's occupying people's thinking, which I think poses quite a lot of questions and challenges, sort of the way that new policies in this area might be rolled out. It needs to be really sensitive to that. Even things that may not cost a lot of money might be perceived to do so among the public.
Mm. We've got another question here about potholes. I think you've kind of answered this, but if my understanding is correct, this is about the sort of the how it's not a controversial issue. But the question is, why is public support fixing potholes quite as high as it is? Is it because of the simplicity of the policy?
Yeah, that could be one factor, couldn't it? And well, we've talked about it a little, haven't we? Seemingly uncontroversial. People might be thinking about the investment that's required there and what they would prefer to have it spent on. There was the Conservative announcement that cancelling part of HS2 would pay for fixing potholes. So maybe that has something to do with it. And as I said earlier, they are something that we can see and feel. It's very tangible, and it can affect all of us on the road. So seems like quite a popular thing to pledge.
Yeah. There's one question here then, which I thought was interesting. Um, oh, sorry, there's been a few questions added in the last few minutes, so I've lost it. Yeah, so I think it's about low public satisfaction with the trains. How do we encourage more people onto the trains? And is there scope for them to become publicly owned? I know we've got a pledge in the Labour manifesto to bring trains back into public ownership. I just wondered how ideological people are about nationalisation. Is it really about nationalisation as a solution, or is it really again about dissatisfaction with what we've got now?
Yeah, so reform on trains hasn't just been talked about by Labour, it was being talked about by the Conservatives as well. So my impression is that maybe there is an ideological thing there, but the public perception of the state of rail and how it is and how it's operating at the moment is probably a bigger factor in driving that public sense that something needs to be done. That's quite a seemingly big change, renationalisation, and the public have a sense that change is needed. And we've seen the statistics about low, relative to other types of public services, lower public satisfaction with local bus services and train companies compared with other things that are some of them delivered by local authorities, actually. And we've seen the statistics on the mood of the nation around rail generally. Not overwhelmingly positive scores when people are answering about value for money, reliability, the sense that they're well run. We also found in some research earlier in the year around strikes that support for strikes in the rail sector was lower than support for strikes among doctors and other healthcare workers, for example. So that kind of paints a bit of a picture about how people are feeling, which is a bit glum around rail.
Yeah, on rail, but also I suppose buses too. Then there's a question here from Nicola Cantania. How to improve transport links, e.g., in the northeast, so public transport is actually a realistic option for people in the same way as it is in London. I think there was some regional polling, wasn't there? Does that bear out in the polling that you've got that in the northeast and areas like that, the public opinion of rail and buses is lower?
Yeah, it certainly looked more negative in the northeast areas in particular, and I think that raises an interesting question about asking the public what they think about bus franchising. It's not actually that easy to ask people about in a single question, because it has, you know, some complexities. But yeah, certainly there seem to be regional differences in how people are viewing buses as well. Um, and yeah, interesting to see what happens with the £2 bus fare cap post election too.
Just two more questions then from me. So, anonymous attendee, great presentation. Thanks to Lizzie and the team. I have to leave at 12. Can we please email the slides after? Yes, we can. We can make the slides available. And just because we've only got a few minutes left, one last one from me then. So, I think we have seen a bit of a drop off in salience around the issue of climate. How likely would it be to make them vote in a particular way? And we've talked about polycrisis. All sounds a bit negative. Are there any reasons to be cheerful?
Yeah, I guess that's a nice way to end, isn't it? Well, 78% told us that they think it is time for change at the next election. And I think we can interpret that as there is a positive edge to that. Sometimes we have a tendency to say things like, oh, you know, people don't like change, but that's that's not what this is showing necessarily. So if people are ready for change, and the polls look like there is going to be a change in government, unless Ipsos and all the other pollsters are very wrong. It looks like people are ready for that, and I think we can interpret that as there's a positive that we can take from that. Yeah.
Brilliant. Look, thank you very much. I think that has generally been fascinating. So thank you so much for your time. Thank you to everybody who attended. There should be some comms that go out after this, so we'll make sure that the slides are shared with you. Please do feel free to continue adding questions, and we'll get back to everybody who has done so. But thanks once again, Lizzie, and yeah,
Thanks for having me.
bye.
Thanks. Bye.
Um...